This presentation, I actually have done this multiple times nationally. I'm actually doing this for the Texas Society of Association Executives next month, and I need the practice. This is all about the multi-generational workplace. Now, I'm going to tell you that the workplace today is made up of 5 generations. And you're probably saying, 5, really? And the reason why I say 5 is my parents' generation is still in the workplace. Why? If you want to understand me, you have to understand my parents. Because one of the things we're going to see is you can understand each generation by understanding their parents' generation. Because most of us, when we left home, we did one of 2 things. We either did exactly what our parents told us to do, or we did the exact opposite. So one of the things we're going to see, and this is one of the things I'm going to get to at the end, all of us have to work with the millennials, or the Gen Ys. They are taking over the world. Okay? They ain't us. They are what are referred to as echo boomers. In many ways, they are the opposite of us. And we love to complain about them. Well, you're going to hear me over and over again say, they is the way they is, because we meet them that way. So, the generations. The way we're going to break this down is I'm going to go through all the generations, and we're going to talk about what were the seminal events that shaped that generation. We're going to talk about what were the technology that shaped that generation. And for baby boomers, you're going to be real surprised. Then we're going to look at how we communicate. And the way I'm going to frame this is, when we left home, how did we communicate with our friends and family? Then we're going to say, how does each generation learn? And I'm going to frame this around the question, what's the capital of Madagascar? How did each generation figure that out? Okay? So who knows what the capital of Madagascar is? Good. Yes. And then I'm going to talk about who each generation's parents. Because one of the things I want you to understand is the generational echo effects. Now, none of these generations are completely homogeneous. In other words, not all of us baby boomers are all alike. Neither are Gen X, neither are Gen Y. But if you understand what the effects were, you'll start getting a feel for why people behave the way they do. And this is particularly true with the kids today in work. By the way, the folks who have the biggest problem with the kids at work, and by the way, anyone who is, I am old enough to be their father, is a kid. Okay? The people who have the biggest problem with them are people who either don't have kids, or still have problems with their kids. And by the way, we still have lots of 30-year-olds living at home. By the way, when my son, who's 31, when he graduated from high school, I gave him 4 choices. He could go get a job, get out of the house. 2, he could join the military and get out of the house. 3, he'd go to a 4-year college and get out of the house. Or 4, he could go to Austin Community College, live at home for 1 year, and then get out of the house. When he graduated from college, we sold the house. There is no bedroom for him to boomerang back into.
I'm hearing a lot of noise.
Simple. So you have this in your handout. This is a birth rate chart. Okay? Now, I want you to notice there are 5 generations here. We start out with the greatest generation. This is my parents' generation. We then move on to the silent generation. Notice what happened to birth rates during the Depression and World War II. They went thunk. Then we have baby boom. Then we have Gen X. Now notice, the silent generation is very small, and Generation X is very small. There is a reason for that. This is their parents. But notice what happened in about the mid-1960s. There are two major events that caused birth rates to flatten out, and they have never gone back up. We're going to talk about all this effect. Now, notice, Gen Y is now the largest generation in the workplace. There are more of them than there are baby boomers. In other words, we had a lot of kids. One of the things we're seeing, and by the way, this is going to affect you, particularly you Gen Xers, is today, Gen Y, they are not having children. Last year was the first year AISD had a decrease in enrollment. And part of that is affordability in Austin, but also is the 0 to 16 cohort is collapsing. We're not having kids. So, when you guys are against immigration, you better like immigration because they're the only ones having kids. And by the way, I want someone to pay my Social Security. So, 5 generations. Let's start going through this. And I said, the first one is the greatest generation, born between 1900 and 1924. This was my parents. My father was born 1920. My mother was born 1918. And by the way, I'm close to 60, so my mom was almost 40 when I was born. This is a generation where almost every male served in the military. Think about that. Just about every male went through the military. This generation also produced every president from Kennedy through George Bush Sr. It is referred to as both the GI generation, and Tom Brokaw labeled this the greatest generation. You'll see through most of the post-World War II, this is the generation that caused the boom after World War II, the industrialization. So, what events affected this generation?
The Depression.
The Depression, big time. I joke, my father, he wasn't frugal, he was cheap. He was an economist in the New York Stock Exchange. I remember in 1964, he bought a brand new VW boat. Had nothing on it. Didn't even have a radio. By the way, I inherited that car 9 years later. He never once washed it. It was red, and everybody remember what happened to red paint back then? It oxidized. My brother and I, we took it to a car wash, we washed it, and we sprayed, and we painted it with red Rust-Oleum. Came out pretty good. So, what other events affected the Depression?
The war.
Dust Bowl, World War I, World War II. So, these folks understood deprivation. These folks knew how to save money. Were your parents risk averse?
Yes.
Yes, big time. By the way, most of us boomers, when we started our career, were very risk averse. We were told, one of my mantras, I was raised to be an employee, to go work for a father-like company that would take care of me. And then they moved my cheeks. Okay? So, what was the technology that affected this group? What's that? Radio? By the way, the very first nationwide radio broadcast was Franklin Roosevelt's first fireside chat. One of the things about Franklin Roosevelt, he was the first president that did not have a booming voice. Right? He was polio victim. We had amplification. What other technology affected this generation?
Telephone.
Yes, I'm gonna take the next generation with it for that, but how about the automobile?
Yes.
Right? The automobile was huge with this generation. Okay, when this generation left home, how did they communicate back?
Later.
They wrote letters. And how did they write them? In longhand, in cursive. By the way, today, if you write in cursive and leave it for a note for a kid, they may not read it. They don't know how to read it. So the point here is, they had written communications. Okay, the last thing. How did they answer the question, what was the capital of Madagascar? Where did they have to go? They had to go to the library. By the way, encyclopedias didn't exist back then. They probably had to go to the library and either go to the atlas or globe. But the point here is, they had to go somewhere outside of the house to get the information. Hopefully you'll see where I'm going with this. Okay? So the point here is, information was not readily available. We cool with this? Okay, so let's move on to the silent generation. The silent generation, born between 1925 and 1945. Silent generation did not produce a single president. Zero. Nada. The last opportunity was John McCain. Okay? We skipped generations. Partially because this is a very small generation. By the way, this generation had the absolutely skyrocketing divorce rates. High levels of alcoholism. If you look at, well, they grew up in really bad times. And there were very few of them. So today, you will find some of them. A silent generation now starts about 70. And so there are some still in the workplace. They have very different attitudes. Do we have anybody in the room? Bingo. So, what events affected this generation? Okay. Vietnam, but more importantly, when I usually ask most folks, no, one of the first ones is JFK's assassination.
And Sputnik first.
Sputnik? Yep. So the space race.
Because that changed the education system.
Yep.
Oh, you could also say nuclear before that.
Nuclear.
Yep. So things like
right under your desk.
the A-bomb, yeah. The one of the ones I usually find is many remember JFK assassination. That had huge effects on the generation. Massive. Okay. What technology affected this generation? Television and
Radio.
telephones.
Telephone.
Right? This is the first generation that had access to telephones and long distance. Remember long distance telephones?
Party lines.
Really? Right? Long distance. Ask the kids today what long distance phone calls are. Right? So the big thing here was phones. Phones and TV. So, when this generation left home, how did they communicate back? Telephone.
Right.
Okay. So we've gone from a written communications to an auditory communications. Okay? In other words, if you have somebody over 70 and you want to communicate with them, talk to them. Okay? How did this generation answer the question, what's the capital of Madagascar?
Encyclopedia at home.
They probably went home. They either had an encyclopedia atlas, but usually it was a lot more readily available. Now, with the early silent generation, they probably still had to go to the library. And the later ones were able to go have it at home. Or in school, but they still probably had to go someplace, right? They had to go find a book someplace. Okay. Let's go to baby boomers. This is where we have fun. The baby boomers. By the way, there are a lot of us. So what events, by the way, we have produced every president since Bill Clinton on. So Bill Clinton, George Bush, Obama, all have been baby boomers. We skipped the generation. And one of the questions will we skip the Gen Xers? It's very possible. And when we get to Gen X, I'll talk about some of the interesting. Okay, baby boomers. It's rather interesting. One of the things I claim with. He asked me how the medical advancements affect these generations. Good question. I'll have to think about that. That's another interesting aspect I haven't thought of. By the way, Jimmy Carter, I claim, is an interesting. Jimmy Carter, from a pure intellectual perspective, was probably one of our most brilliant presidents. He was a nuclear engineer. The guy was brilliant. He was a really stupid president. He did a lot of stupid stuff. He surrounded himself with a lot of stupid people. Versus someone like Ronald Reagan, who wasn't the brightest guy in the world. But he surrounded himself with really smart people. So just because the president is smart doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a good president. Yes?
Do you think this is because Ronald Reagan came from a small town and it was from a generation that worshiped Henry Ford, who said, surround yourself with smart people and you'll look brilliant?
Who knows? One of the things that,
whereas in the Navy, they said you have to be brilliant, and so Jimmy Carter figured he had to be the brilliant guy.
could be. Now my mind just went blank. I had an idea. I'll think of it. So with baby boomers, what events affected our generation?
Women's lib and birth control.
Okay, we're going to talk about that next. Vietnam. So what you'll find is Vietnam affected early baby boomers. Now, who in here served in Vietnam? Okay. If you served in Vietnam, did you volunteer? Or were you drafted?
Volunteer.
Volunteers. Anybody drafted? Okay. This is pretty typical. If you find a college-educated group, you'll find the number of hands that go up who served in Vietnam is very small. Because, by the way, the folks who served in Vietnam were largely poor, and by the way, a third of them had green cards. Now, those who were college educated and volunteered had the highest casualty rate. Why? Because they went to fight. Draftees went to survive. They would go for a year and they would just simply try and make sure and get through it. Vietnam was really a screwed up war. And we're seeing that over and over again as some of this stuff comes out for what went through with Johnson. But it's one of the things that greatly divided our generation.
Well, it was the first war that was light and color.
Yes. Who remembers, anybody remembers Walter Cronkite coming back and saying, this is screwed? And by the way, he had to have an editorial at the end of the newscast. Right? Yes, I remember as a kid, Life magazine, there was a very famous issue where they took the pictures of everyone who had died the previous week. It was like 500. So when we look at the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, the number of folks who were killed was a fraction of what it was in Vietnam. That had a horrific effect on our generation. Then we had Watergate. And what we'll find is Watergate has a much greater effect on late baby boomers, those born after 55. Now, I was born in 56. I remember as a 13-year-old, I was working one summer at Howard Johnson's as a desk clerk. And I would come home and watch the Watergate trials in the afternoon. So,
I remember one of my teachers saying this in college. He said, when we were kids, we called the federal government Uncle Sam. You people call them the feds.
yes.
And it's a very different mentality.
Now, remember what I said about our parents' generation. All of our fathers served in the military. What did most of us do? We stayed out of the military. I remember when I taught high school, I went off from 2004 to 2006 to teach high school. I taught high school, algebra 1 and 2 down at Aikens High School in South Austin. And both Veterans Days, it was assumed by people that I was a veteran. And I went, hell no, we tried to stay out. That's one reason why we were so educated, because we went to college in droves. Or had kids. Well, actually, believe it or not, the Vietnam War, one of the effects was we delayed marriage and delayed having children. Well, the next piece is technology. The number one technology that affected our generation was the pill. 1965. Now, by the way, along with the pill, in 1972, we had Roe v. Wade. Now, by the way, exactly 20 years after Roe v. Wade, crime rates started to plummet. If you read Freakonomics, it's 20 years afterwards, Clinton and the government, they were worried, crime rates were soaring, and then they went off like a cliff. Why? I can speak from experience, teaching high school and inner city high school. Teenage boys in poverty. Well, number one, teenage boys do stupid things. When you throw poverty in, they do really stupid things. Okay? When you start reducing kids being born into poverty, which what happened between birth control and Roe v. Wade, that's what happened. And by the way, when we talk about our huge number of persons in prison, from 1950 to now, we actually have the same percentage of the population in prisons that we did in 1950. By the way, the population has doubled. Anybody can play with statistics. So, the technology was a pill. Anybody else want to throw another one in?
Integrated circuits.
Not even close.
Airplanes.
Not even close. Technology.
Oh, airplanes.
I'm going to say, listen to this. Visa. 1969, credit cards. Okay, our parents' generation saved every last dime.
Trivia question. Who was the guy who invented them?
I don't know.
Walter Wriston.
Okay? I'll remember.
Now check him out, because
Okay.
he also said this will be the end of money.
Okay.
And Fed policy changed when they heard that.
Okay.
We were off the gold standard.
Yep.
And a number of other things were done during the Nixon administration after Walter Wriston opened his mouth and said, we can create money in the banking system.
Interesting. So, number one, credit cards. Two, we were a generation that was marketed to. So, 1962, I will never forget, I was 6 years old, Sunday night, was the Flintstones. It was on 6 o'clock Eastern time. Anybody remember who the advertiser was?
Winston cigarettes.
Winston Cigarettes. We were the first generation that was marketed to. So, remember, Visa and the pill, and boy, we know how to spend money. Our parents retired quite comfortably. By the way, the average baby boomer has less than $80,000 saved for retirement. So, how did we answer the question, what was the capital of Madagascar?
Encyclopedia.
Encyclopedia. Where was the encyclopedia? At home. Remember, we had I had a world book first. Remember the yearbooks? Oh, yearbooks were cool, man. You get the yearbook every year. But we were cool. My parents afterwards bought Encyclopedia Britannica. Right? But the point here is, we had to go home. We could look up anything. It was in the encyclopedia. But the point here is, we still had to go home. Now, our parents largely were the greatest generation. Obviously, there are going to be skews, but most of our parents were the greatest generation. Our parents saved money. We spent every last dime. Our parents were very risk averse. You know what? We were pretty risk averse. I mean, my parents expected me to go work for a big company. So what did I do? I went to work for IBM. And I did that for 22 years. Until they screwed me. And I was one of the rare ones who went, bye. I don't trust you anymore. When we left home, how did we communicate? Telephone. Who remembers? 2 rings and hang up. Yes. 2 rings and hang up. Well, the idea was you'd call your parents, ring it twice, and then your parents would call you back. So you didn't have to pay the long distance. Okay. We are an auditory generation. This is one of the things that you need to teach the younger folks. By the way, how old are you? Okay, you're old. Okay. One of the things that you need to teach the younger generation, if you have a 25-year-old, tell them, if they've got a baby boomer boss and they want to be heard, you need to come talk to me. I can't tell you, I've done this for a number of groups of young kids, and they all walk up and say, okay, I'll call my mom. I won't text her anymore, I'll call her. We want to be talked to. And again, our parents, to a large extent, were greatest generation. Now, we're going to move on to Gen X. Poor Gen X. Gen X, there are very few of you. The poor Gen X, there weren't enough of you to cause change. No one cares about you. Yes, they're all complaining the fact that particularly the academics, baby boomers won't retire, so they can't. There are tons and tons of guys in their 30s and 40s with PhDs that are waiting to become college professors, and the baby boomers won't retire. Now, if you look at Generation X, it's a very small, it's under 50 million. But if you look at the census data, there are over 80 million. Why? Immigration. So one of the key things that you will look at is Generation X, on a whole, looks nothing like their parents' generation. So there are multiple Gen X presidential candidates this year. 3 of them in the Republicans. Marco Rubio, who comes from immigrant parents. Our lovely senator from the state of Texas, Ted Cruz, he has Cuban parents. And then there's Bobby Jindal, who has Indian parents. So when you start looking at, if you look at the silent generation, it's 93% white. As you start looking at the Gen X, it's nowhere near. And when we get to Gen Y, white is not, Caucasian is not the majority population. So one of the things we're going to see is we're going to see a dramatic shift. And by the way, we're going to see this worldwide. So the concept of black, white, brown, yellow, whatever, is to a large extent, become less and less of a factor as the generations age. Why? Because they're all mixed together. Okay? We cool with this? So Generation X is a very interesting one. So, what events affected Generation X? Events. What happened during their years? This is a typical reaction. It's called nothing! There were no galvanizing effects. No, that's after that. Well, that's even after. I mean, they're already grown in the workforce.
They say California leads the nation. And 20 years ago, California had a referendum that passed overwhelmingly that would have ended racial preferences in all state programs. And interestingly enough, it was led by a black man named Lord Connerly.
Okay.
And many blacks supported it for the same reasons he did, saying, yes, it's time to do away with this. But the education establishment kept it in place with lawsuits and funding of the ACLU. But do you think that as California leads the nation, we're going to see this nationwide?
No.
No?
No.
Okay. You think administratively the courts...
Oh, I think we've reached a point in our government that nothing happens. So, I know what I just went. Oh, the silent generation. One thing I forgot about the silent. You know why it's called the silent generation? No. 1951, there was a Time magazine article that said, this generation doesn't do anything. They're quiet. Well, all of us baby boomers. Rock and roll. Who created rock and roll? We don't think it's us.
No, it's the silent
Bullshit, it's the silent generation. Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles. They're all silent generation. Civil rights. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, Joan Baez. Gosh, my other ones, my mind's gone blank. All were of silent generation. Bob Dylan, that was, thank you.
Jerry Garcia.
Yeah, all of those were of silent generation. So it's interesting. I've done this talk for a number of groups, and I had one guy go, "Oh God!" I think he was a rock and roll fan. He's going, "We didn't create any of this." Right. Most of the stuff we grew up listening to was not created by our generation, but the previous generation. They were anything but silent. Okay? So, Generation X. So the events, they didn't have much. They didn't have much. You know, it might have been the Persian Gulf War, but that really didn't have a lot of effect. You had the Challenger crash. Did that really change anything? No. Yes. Discovery of AIDS has been a very, very slow process, and it. If you want to say, did it affect Generation X? It affected a lot of generations. I think it was a lot cross-generational. But it took a very, very, very long time for that change to occur. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. You didn't. But we can get into that. So, Generation X. What technologies affected Generation X?
VHS.
What's that?
The internet?
No, computers. Computers, they were the first generation to have computers. They were, now, were they connected to the internet?
No.
No. What were they connected to?
Bulletin boards.
Bulletin boards. Remember CompuServe?
Or mainframes.
Right? Yeah. Dial up. They were the first ones as kids.
200 balls.
Now, so they were also given that. How did they communicate? They were phones, but they were the first ones that had emails or have some kind of electronic communications. So what we see is we started with our parents having written, we went to auditory, and we're heading back to written, kind of. Because we'll talk about the kids next. Okay? Now, this generation, how did they answer the question, what's the capital of Madagascar?
They posted it on a bulletin board, or they looked it up on the internet if they had access to a university mainframe.
Okay. The idea was they probably went home. It might have been on a CD. It might have been on a bulletin board. They might have had access to something electronic. They were the first ones who could look things up. But the big thing was, he said microfiche, which is that you're old.
I'm from that generation.
How old are you? Oh, God. Well, you're actually very cross. You're right in the middle. Okay. The key piece here is they probably still had to go home. Okay? Now, they might have had encyclopedia, but it wasn't, again, they had access electronically, but it wasn't readily available. By the way, when I was at IBM in 1990, and I was part of the team that was launching the first Unix product, we were the first ones to have documentation on CD. And it was pre-internet, pre-HTML, and it was all hyperlinked. So the reality is the internet really didn't come to fruition until the mid to late 90s. So this group probably had to go home. Now, this generation, who were their parents?
Silent generation.
Largely silent, some boomers. Now, what we see is the silent generation had the highest divorce rate. Divorce rates from the mid-60s on soared. Why? We heard it back there. Women's liberation and the pill. So, this generation separated like crazy. So, Gen Xers largely were the first latchkey kids. Almost half of them grew up in single-parent households. Blended families, in other words, they were the first generation that divorce was prevalent. So therefore, Gen Xers have the lowest divorce rate. Why? They don't get married. I did this workshop for the Texas Healthcare Recruiting Association. And a young lady sitting in front, and she just looked at me and says, this is in Cleveland, this is San Antonio. She just looks at me and says, yeah, I tell my parents I'm gay and they get off my case about getting married. So what we see with this generation is, number one, they have delayed marriage. One of the things we see in the Gen X generation is, I'm gonna work real hard, I'm gonna have success, I'm gonna delay marriage, I'm gonna delay having kids, and then suddenly, a lot of women suddenly go, my biological clock is running out. When I was at my first startup in 2003, I had a woman who was 32 who worked for me, and her and 8 of her friends, all were 32 and above, all went, our biological clocks are running out, we need to have kids. And when sure enough, within a year and a half, they were all pregnant. So, very, 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 very prevalent. So, this generation has very low divorce rates. By the way, they tend to marry much older and having kids much older. By the way, they are producing Generation Z, which is going to look very different from Gen Y. We cool with this? Well, okay. So these folks, as I said, you'll see most of these have silent. The exception is because of Vietnam. Because of Vietnam, a lot of us delayed marriage and delayed having kids. So therefore, some Gen Xers actually come from baby boomer parents. So I'll use an example. My son was born when I was 28. My wife was 30. By many of our standards, those are people who are college educated. We actually had kids real early. One of the things we see, and by the way, this is one of the things we see worldwide. The more education women get, the fewer children they have. And by the way, the later they have children. And this is cross-cultural. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. This is one of the things I saw when I taught high school math. By the way, when I taught high school, 95% of my kids were on free and reduced lunch. On free and reduced lunch, which means they're economically disadvantaged. My second year of teaching, where I was teaching Algebra 2, I had 6 pregnancies in my classroom file. We had 60 pregnancies, 29 pregnant. All, again, the culture of poverty has nothing to do with Hispanic, African American. It's a culture of poverty. So, let's move on to Gen Y, or also known as the millennials. Okay, Gen Y, everybody loves to complain about them. They grew up entitled. They want everything. They come in and they ask for everything. Why? Because we told them to. Okay? So, what was the event that affected this generation? That's not an event. But 9/11 is a big one. 9/11 changed everything for this generation. Now, my son is a very old Gen Yer. He's born in 1984, so he's 31 now. This generation, big as 9/11, what technology affected this generation?
Cell phones.
Internet. They grew up. My son is a very old millennial. When he entered college in 2002, they handed him a laptop. He went to the University of Dayton. Every place he went had an Ethernet adapter, had an Ethernet cable. Now, this is pre-Wi-Fi. I mean, Wi-Fi started out in about 2001, 2002. Okay? So him being old, he was on the very front end. They grew up connected. I will not forget when my son was in middle school, and this would have been 1998. He needed to do a research, it was 96. He had to do a research project comparing Clinton and Dole. And he found everything on the internet. He found everything on the internet. Okay? No longer did we have to go to the encyclopedia. So, when they need to answer the question, what's the Kepler-Matic gas star, what do?
Pull out your cell phone.
They pull out the cell phone and they Google it. Right? One of the differences, this is a generation that grew up in packs, group learning. One of the key pieces that's different with this generation, and remember this, almost every corporate mission and value statement is based on strong individualism. We didn't raise these kids to be strong individuals. We raised them to be good team players. They did everything in groups. If you ask them to do something, what do? They go find a buddy to do it with. They're going to find a group. They don't do stuff by themselves because their entire educational system was built around that. By the way, they don't memorize stuff. So last year I had to speak I was a keynote speaker at the Career Thought Leaders Conference in Baltimore, and we went into one evening into one of the big crab restaurants, crab cake restaurants, and on the walls were all these stained glass, and they all had numbers in them. And so I asked the waiter, what are all these things? So, there's numbers. Oh, in the old days, all the houses had the street numbers on the houses with the stained glass in the front. And all of these survived the Great Baltimore Fire. So what did I ask him? When was the Great Baltimore Fire? By the way, he was 28. He goes, he's dancing around because he don't know. So what do? I look it up. 1905. He comes back 5 minutes later. 1905. So what's the difference between him and me? I remembered it. Will he? Probably not. We memorize stuff. I can still tell you the capital of Illinois is Springfield. They don't memorize things. And by the way, it pisses us off. Why don't they know this? They don't have to. So for example, my breakfast club, we had the dean of the UT Medical School come in and talk. And one of the things he talked about was the
I'm going to
elimination.
disagree with your statement that they don't have to know. One of the findings of the National Transportation Safety Board about that crash in San Francisco about 2 years ago,
Yep.
the pilot of the plane is from this Generation Y. The generation you say doesn't believe they have to
No,
remember
he was not.
things.
He was not of Generation Y. He was in his late 30s.
Okay, well, he
He
didn't
was a
think he
Gen
had to
Xer.
remember things.
Okay.
And he didn't remember the protocols for looking at things like your airspeed indicator
I
and your
understand.
altimeter, and this is why the plane crashed.
Okay.
The older pilots have criticized this
Yes.
very heavily.
Okay. The key piece here is the dean of the medical school saying they're de-emphasizing memorization with the training of doctors. Now, by the way, in my breakfast club, which is loaded with folks who are my age and older, they were going, "Oh my God, they're not going to memorize stuff." And the answer is no. They can always look it up. And the training of doctors is more about, if you're not sure, go look it up, because things are changing so fast. Right? Things are changing astronomically fast. So the key piece here is they are technologically wired, and by the way, they are the exact opposite of us. They are echo globes. Now, when they need to communicate, how do they do it? Text. Okay. If you're going to communicate with a kid, learn how to text them. By the way, teach them, if they want to communicate with you, talk to them. Talk to their boss. So, for example, if you call a millennial and leave a voicemail, will they listen to it? No. What they'll do is they'll notice, I can't tell you the number of parents I've heard says, "Yeah, I call them, I leave them a voicemail, and they immediately call me back. Mom, I saw you call. Did you listen to my voicemail?" No. Now, by the way, I have taught my wife to text. My wife's a massage therapist and nurse. The reason why? She can get to a point. Don't ever tell her that. My wife is one of these people who will leave me three-minute voicemails. So, yes, he's asking is do you think it's because it's short? And the answer is yes. These kids have very short they have been taught to constantly multitask, which, by the way, multitasking doesn't work. We all know that. But they're so, for example, I use the example when my son went to college. I kept track of him by his AOL away message. One day I was at home, I was working, and his away message said, "Out sledding." By the way, he went to the University of Dayton in Southern Ohio. So when he came back in, I texted him and said, "So were you out using the cafeteria trays?" And he goes, "Dad, how did you know?" I grew up in Jersey. When it snowed at school, we had a big hill out in front of the high school. We got the cafeteria trays. Some things don't change. Okay? So number one, they will text. They are connected. Now, their parents were us. And the key piece here is they are the opposite of us. Okay? What did we tell the kids? Follow your passion. That's why God knows how many have art history degrees and anthropology degrees. What else? We were hyper competitive. So what do we do with our kids? Everyone gets a blue ribbon. Everyone gets a trophy. So one of the things when we don't see our boss for 3 weeks, we go, yes. With the kids, one of the things you have to do is every few days go, hey, Gary, great, good job, thanks. Don't have to spend a lot of time stroking them, but you need to stroke them. And you have to stroke them frequently. They expect that. For example, when my son went to college, he came home. He was home for 9 months after he graduated. By the way, he turned into a decent human being. He's off my payroll. He works for Navy intelligence now. He buys weapon systems. I have this great T-shirt I need to bring in. He gave me for my birthday. On the back, it's all black and it has a submarine rising out of the ocean. The image on the bottom, it says, "Sleep tight, we got this." By the way, Navy intelligence is an oxymoron. So one of the key things I want is these are essentially, if you look at the connecting, number one, the greatest generation largely produced baby boomers. So I want you to see the echo effects. Gen X was largely produced by silent or baby boomers. And lastly, the millennials are echo of us. In other words, every time you want to complain about them, we made them. So, the other thing you have to understand, by the way, I need to change this chart. Today, Gen Y outnumbers us now. This happened this year. By 2025, they are going to be by far the majority. They will change the world. And I hate to tell you this, for the good. Okay? They do not look like us. We have the idea of, well, right now, something on the order of 25% of African American women are marrying outside their race. We are seeing blended racial at record rates. By the way, they are abandoning traditional religions at record. That does not mean they're not religious. They're abandoning traditional churches. This is where the Republican Party has got to be real careful because they're going to screw themselves. They do not look like our generation. They are very, if you look at things like gay marriage, they go, what's the big deal? Now, they are completely different. Okay, this is a chart, I didn't put it because I can't print it very well, but there are a lot of misconceptions about the millennials. So number one, the millennials see themselves as very people savvy. And we go, what the? Right? And we're going, no, they're not. They're people savvy, very different than us. When my son went off to college in 2002, when he would land on spring break or on Christmas break, they all knew where everybody was. His buddies, he went to McAllen High School. They went everywhere. They came back, they knew exactly where there was. When my son got married in 2011, in Washington, D.C., 2 of his band buddies were in his wedding party. He had left Austin years early. They stayed connected. They're social in a very different way. If you go into, like I go down to Austin Java, and you'll walk in there, and there are these clouds of kids that will take up a room. They're highly social. Now they may be sitting in the room, all texting one another to the person next to them, but they're highly social. Next thing, We say, oh, they're tech savvy. That is complete bullshit. I'm sorry, it's my generation that created this. Okay? By the way, I was working on all this stuff back for a long time. Okay? Now, my son can whip my ass using it. They are technological consumers. And they know that. The next one is the one, they go, we're loyal to our employers. And we go, what? By the way, 1% of us say, you're loyal? And then the big difference, when our employers screwed us, we stayed loyal. With them, their employer screws them, they leave. Why do they do that?
They know where to find a new job.
No.
They want to find somebody they feel like they can be loyal to.
No. We told them to. We told them, follow your passion. Ask for what you want. Which is the exact opposite of what we did. They saw their parents, particularly in the 90s, get screwed by their employers. And they go, I'm going to do that. But if you treat them right, they will be loyal. So one of the biggest problems we have in Austin is with small tech companies, particularly Gen X and baby boomer managers managing millennials or Gen Y. They'll tell them, you got to be here at 8 o'clock in the morning. And they'll go, what? And if you can't give them a darn good reason, what? Because I told you to. No. Why? Now, like my son, because he grew up, when he went off to college, he could work from anywhere. They've done this their entire career, so telling them they have to come in the office and you can't give them a good reason just because I told you to, don't work. Oh, they'll walk in and say, well, when can I get promoted? Why do they do that? We told them to. We told them to ask for what they wanted. By the way, when we were in college or we got our first jobs, we wanted to do the same thing. We just didn't do it. So again, they are the opposite of us. We cool with this? Now, they say they're hardworking, and we go, what? Now, by the way, when I did this first talk about a year ago, I did it here, and you saw Brendan. Brendan was Brendan Stern. I asked him, he had, if you don't notice, when he got from Indeed, he always brings in, I always call his kids. I asked him the one day, I said, so when do your kids come to work? And he says, well, I take my real kids, I drop them off at school around 8 o'clock, I'm in the office at 8:30. And they start rolling in about 9:30, 10 o'clock. He said, but I can text them anytime, day and night, and they will respond. They do not have the same boundaries of work that we do. Right? They are different. They have different expectations. You're loyal to them, they will be very loyal to you. You screw with them, they will screw with you. They will walk. By the way, the reason they do that is because we told them to. And by the way, we should have done the same thing. There are any number of times in my career I should have walked. I think most of you can relate to that. So, they is the way they is, because we made them that way. So, I've got some, so number one, the level of educational attainment with this group is incredibly high. Why? Because most of them came out during the Great Recession, coming out of college, and they went back and got college. By the way, they have astronomical student loan debt. They are the most indebted generation ever. My son and his wife cannot afford to buy a house. because my daughter-in-law accrued about $90,000 in student loan debt to go back and get a master's degree. Neither one of them had student loan debt from undergraduate. Very common. One of the other big things, most of us were raised to get an employment resume. Okay? I got my first job when I was 13, working for Howard Johnson. Most of us in our 50s probably got our first job, paying job, sometime in the middle teens. Most of our kids did not get their first job until college, and sometimes not until after college. And by the way, internships are not real jobs. So one of the key pieces is we raise them to get a college resume. So when they come out of college, they don't know how to be an employee. You need to teach them. Well, they should know it. No, they don't. They've never worked for somebody. Things like showing up to work on time. What? Customer service. Yep, dress code. Yeah, they don't, you gotta teach them that. They don't know it. And why don't they know it? Because we didn't allow them to learn that as teenagers. Again, it's all because of us. We didn't want, my son, I didn't want him going to work. He worked some. Unfortunately, when he was 16, 17, 18, was during the dot-com bust, and there weren't any jobs during the summer. He eventually got a lifeguard job with the city of Austin, and he worked at Schlitterbahn one summer. A lot of funny stories with him. Lots of funny stories. So they have this idea of two-way expectation. They want to be treated with respect, and they will treat you with respect. You crap on them, and they will crap on you. So I'm going to skip over these exercises. But one of the things I usually do this is I ask people, okay, if you're going to go ask somebody, you go ask them for lunch. And you're going to go ask them how would you go ask them? If you're a 65-year-old, you probably walk to their desk. 55-year-old, you probably call. 45-year-old might call or text. 35-year-old might text, might email, right? And 25-year-old probably text. Now, what if that person was 20 years younger or older? Here's the key piece. If a 25-year-old texts a 45-year-old, will that work?
Probably not.
Very likely it will if that 45-year-old has a teenager at home. Okay. I did this talk for a big staffing agency back a year ago in Tampa. Had a room with 200 people. And I showed up the day before, and I noticed all of them, most of them baby boomers, a few Gen Xers, were all texting their kids back home. So I asked them during the session, okay, you modified your communication style for your kids. Are you willing to do it for your younger employees? And you could see throughout the room going, oh shit, he's right. So one of the things, as you start looking at different generations, if I want Charles to listen to me, I have to adapt to him. If I want a younger person to listen to me, I need to adapt to them. When I went to China, which I did a lot of training in China, I didn't expect them to become Americans. I adapted all my training to the Chinese, which I got lots of funny stories on how I did that. Similarly, if you want someone to listen to you, you need to adapt to them. And you need to teach the kids to adapt to you. We cool with this? So with that, each generation is not this big homogeneous. It's very heterogeneous. Hopefully one of the things you've walked away here today is understanding the echo effects. We have to adapt to one another. Gen Y is going to change the world. And I claim for the good. And lastly, Gen Y is the way they is. Because we made them that way. Okay? Was this good?